Crow at Dusk by Charlene Logan Burnett. As the delivery van drove through the museum gate, Roland opened his umbrella and stepped out. "We're here with the Marguerite Gerard paintings," the driver said. "You have the paperwork?" Roland asked. The woman in the passenger seat handed him the shipping documents, and on her inside wrist, the tongue of a snake tattoo flicked out from under her sleeve. Roland squinted at the papers. The rain was coming down harder, and he dared not move his umbrella for more light. "You got a problem?" the driver said. "You want the paintings or not?" No, Roland didn't want the paintings. He did not care for Marguerite Gerard's style. Daylilies bloomed erotically, vines grew between women's legs, depraved hummingbirds flicked out their skinny tongues, and dewdrops quivered on every surface as if the world was saturated and overheated. But Roland had no say in the museum. He was a security officer, and his job, as the curator often reminded him, was to stand against a wall and make sure children didn't stick chewing gum on the paintings. He signaled the driver to back the van under the covered loading dock, and the woman climbed out. She was petite, her face smooth and clear like a child's. Her hair was short and mink-colored, her lips rosy, and if not for the tattoo, she reminded him of his own grandchild, who he hadn't seen in many years. "I'm Jess," she said, "Marguerite's grandniece. I'll be overseeing the hanging and the lighting." He was supposed to buzz the curator, let her know when the paintings arrived, but surely he was capable of escorting Jess and the driver inside. He'd once run his own company. He had well over 200 employees at the height of his business, and he knew how to act professionally. As they passed through the gallery, which housed the museum's permanent collection of 19th century American art, he pointed out the building's Federalist architecture, its classical details, the moldings, cornices, and columns. Jess stared at the ceiling medallion, an intricate design of ribbons and flowers. "Exquisite. You appreciate such things?" he asked. "Why wouldn't I?" She looked at him, one studded eyebrow raised. "Well, your great aunt, it's a certain style, quite different from our museum's flavor. Marguerite is all about breaking traditional notions of art. Well, I guess I'm the traditionalist. When he had his business, he'd been too busy to think about much else. It was his wife, Stella, who had been an active member of the Museum Guild. But over the past year, he'd spent hours standing at his post in the gallery. The most recent exhibit, Hay in Art, was his favorite, especially the Julian Dupre paintings. He could well imagine stepping into such a world where at the end of the day, the hay was neatly stacked in domes, scythes were finely idle, and a maiden wearing a white bonnet offered him a ladle of water. That evening, Roland went home to his apartment. He fed the cat and opened the slider to the patio. It was still raining, and Mr. Cat refused to go out. A few minutes later, Roland heard him scratching inside the litter box. He heated a can of tomato soup and toasted a slice of bread, and he ate on the couch facing the slider. He'd never liked rain. His company, Perry Electronics, had shipped nationwide year-round. Rain or snow in the Rockies meant delays. Before his wife's illness, she would chide him, "You can't control the weather, so why fret?" But he did, often going into the office at night to radio his drivers to pull over if conditions got worse. Mr. Cat walked across the length of the sofa's backrest and sat on the edge, flicking its tail. They both stared at the door, unable to see past rain pelting the glass. On evenings like this, he missed his home, which he sold after Stella died. There was no reason to keep such a large house. His daughter no longer spoke to him. There would be no family reunions there. When his business faltered, he needed the cash, and all he took with him was Mr. Cat, whom Stella had rescued when he'd only been the size of her hand. The rain continued through the night and into the morning, and the drive to the museum was slow. Lights at intersections were out, and a limb from a hickory tree had fallen on the road. Although the museum was closed on Mondays and Tuesdays, and Roland wasn't officially working on those days, he liked routine. He laid his open umbrella in the hall to dry, hung his raincoat in his locker. He clipped on his security badge. At precisely 8 a.m., he slid the magnet on the attendant's whiteboard to in. He poured his first cup of coffee. Mary, the clerical assistant, always kept a pint of half and half in the refrigerator just for him. "Raining cats and dogs," he said. "That it is," Mary pointed to the box of donuts. He chose jelly, his favorite, which Mary knew. "Everything in order?" he asked. "We didn't lose electricity during the night." "Not that I know about. A bit of water seeped in through one of the basement windows, but nothing too serious. I have maintenance checking on it." "Well, I'll take a look around, make sure all else is secured." He carried his coffee and donut. That was how he started his mornings at Perry Electronics, walking the warehouse floor with his foreman. He passed the curator in the hall. "Morning," he said cheerfully. She gave a perfunctory nod. She was half his age, educated at Brown like his daughter. They were both of the boomer generation, everything given to them. There were 3 galleries in the building, and the permanent collection was on the main floor. Single and group shows of local artists were held in the annex. The Great Hall housed the current exhibition. He started in the basement to check on the leaking window. He looked over the maintenance man's shoulder. "Looks like you've got it. Should hold until it dries out and I can seal it properly." He wiped his hands on a towel. "Haven't seen this kind of rain since I left Florida." Roland checked the ground floor perimeter walls and other windows for damage. The building, built in 1802, was sealed and secure. He took the elevator. The crew was prepping the hall for the Girard exhibit. Already the stillness of the McCarthy was disrupted by the show's accompanying theatrics. Frogs chirped over a piped-in elevator music, and a tropical green light seeped in through the seams in the elevator. Roland felt a wave of nausea. But then the brass door slid open, and a large black bird flew in at him. He ducked. The bird was well over a foot tall. Its wings spanned wider than Roland's shoulders, and while he fumbled for his radio, the bird struck at the button panel. The elevator bell chimed, and the doors closed. Roland pressed against the wall. It was a crow, entirely black with glossy sheen. It had large, scaly claws, and its beak looked like it was made of onyx. It tilted its head from side to side as the elevator rode downward, its translucent third eyelid opening and closing. Roland fumbled for the press-to-talk button on his radio. "Need assistance here. Main elevator. Not sure what floor we're opening on." The doors parted on the ground floor, and the bird flew out. Roland followed. The bird ducked into the front foyer and circled counterclockwise, flying into the adjoining room. The curator and Mary ran out from the administrative office. "What's the problem?" the curator asked, irritated. "A bird," Roland said. "If you go that way, you can head it off at the annex." Birds did not belong in museums, especially not here, where early American antiques were displayed among the artwork. The curator hustled down the hallway, then Mary radioed maintenance. For the next 2 hours, they scoured the building but could not find the bird. "Are you sure you weren't imagining it?" asked the curator with a weary tone. Roland knew she thought he was feeble-minded. He looked to Mary and the maintenance man, but they glanced away, not wanting to align themselves with an old man. He spent the rest of the day on watch. He kept his eye on tall things, such as the Simon Willard grandfather clock. He looked for bird droppings on the floor. He ventured into the Gerard exhibit, which meant he had to step through a curtain of green light projected from spotlights. A life-size self-portrait of Ms. Gerard caught his attention. She was older than he imagined. She had dark features, yet brilliantly white hair, which grew upward to form branches. Vines grew like armor across her breasts, although her chest was slit vertically and peeled back to reveal her exposed heart. "You found her?" Jessie said. She wore white coveralls over a tank top. Her arms were densely tattooed in a canopy of greenery, and the orange and blue snakes slithering down her arm appeared iridescent. He again felt nauseous and dizzy. The snake's forked tongue twitched. He blinked and swallowed. He looked back at the life-size painting. In the branches of Marguerite's hair, he spotted a nest of baby birds. "I suppose you know what it all means," he said. "The birds, for example." "Crows are often messengers. They teach us about intuition." "I saw a crow today in the building. I tried to hunt it down. It seems to have vanished." Jess smiled as she closed her toolbox. Maybe it had something it wanted to tell you. Roland wondered as he watched her leave. Was it possible she was behind a publicity stunt? "You're still here?" the curator said, walking into the hall, her heels tapping against the marble flooring as she cornered Roland. "The crow came in with these paintings," he said. "It's the only explanation." "There are no live birds in this building," she said. "We've checked every inch of it." She reached to turn out the overhead lights. "Go home." In that instant, before darkness, Roland was sure he saw in the portrait one of the crow's iridescent wings fill and lift. The rain tapered off by the time Roland arrived at the apartment. He opened the slider, and Mr. Cat walked out. He turned around and came right back in. After the cat had used the litter box, Roland cleaned it out, not a chore he relished, but he reminded himself of how fond Stella had been of the cat. During her illness, it had slept near her heart. Mr. Cat was never affectionate with Roland, and that evening they sat on opposite ends of the couch and stared out at the slider. There wasn't much to see, just a rain-drenched patio. He'd never planted anything in the dirt that framed the cement pad. He'd never put out a chair or a table. It was Stella who enjoyed embellishing the yard and home, entertaining family and friends. He looked at the white walls of his apartment. Not a nail or a mark on them. Mr. Cat swished his tail. Roland wondered how it would feel if the cat were to sleep curled near him. Well, Roland arrived early the opening night of the Girard exhibit. Volunteers of the museum's auxiliary guild were setting out name tags, and he imagined his wife sitting behind the check-in table, her hand outstretched, offering him his name tag. "Your name isn't on the list," the guild member said. He didn't take the blank stick-on name tag she handed him. His security guard shield was all he needed. A local caterer was setting up inside the hall. Instead of the customary white tablecloths, she had draped 2 long tables in purple. Fiery orange lilies dominated the floral arrangements, and a large wheel of brie was smothered in what looked like quivering orange fish eggs. "I'm so excited about meeting Marguerite Girard tonight," the caterer said. Roland sampled a chunk of pineapple. "How many people do you have helping you tonight?" He'd like to know the temporary help in case they wandered off and stole anything. She nodded a young man and a girl who were lining up wine glasses on the other table. "Just us." They were regular helpers and quite trustworthy. The curator was early, of course. She stood in the center of the hall surveying the paintings. He went over to ask her about the crow, but before he got the words out, she said, "Roland, I told you you don't need to be here." Her sharp tone reminded him of how his daughter had spoken to him after she became an adult. Jess was one of the first guests to arrive. She wore a short, tight, iridescent teal dress that looked like snakeskin. She walked over to where he stood near the self-portrait of her great-aunt. "Have you found your bird yet?" "It's not my bird," he said. He was a reasonable man who'd followed routine through his 80-plus years, and he was not prone to hallucinations or hysterics. Birds did not fly out of paintings to speak with him. He was steady, the man at the wheel of his ship. Other guests soon arrived, and they barraged Jess with questions about her great-aunt. "What is she like? Will she be here? I can't wait to meet her." Roland stood against the far wall and watched as the town's gentry, who included the museum board members, retrieved their name badges and properly printed ahead of time, of course. They entered the room oohing and ahhing about how the green lighting changed the color of their skin. They walked by Roland as if he was nothing more than a section of wall. When his business was still solvent, he made sure that every employee felt part of the team. He treated the janitors with the same respect he gave the foreman. Christmas bonuses were divided equally. He knew his employees thought of him as family, and they'd include him in their celebrations in their homes. The opening reception for the exhibit was seeing a record number of attendees. In addition to town patrons, there were artists and art students. It's a good thing Roland was there, because fingers and noses were getting dangerously close to the art. "No touching the paintings," Roland told an elderly woman. "They're so delicious, I just want to touch them." He understood her curiosity. If he was less disciplined, he too might reach out and feel a dewdrop to see if it were real. Ms. Gerard arrived 30 minutes into the gala. She was not as flamboyant as he imagined. She was diminutive. Her hair was indeed snow white, tinged green in the light, but she wore it as his wife had done, in a stylish chignon at the nape of her neck. She wore black like most artists. The neckline of her blouse was low, revealing a satiny red peak of camisole. All eyes were upon her. She smiled as if she saw each person in the room. And when she glanced at him, he felt his heart quicken. "Ms. Gerard, we are honored," the curator said, taking control of the room with her loud voice. She hovered near the artist, blocking Roland's view. He studied the self-portrait. He did not understand why her chest was slit open and her heart exposed. And the crows, why were they nesting in her hair? "You like?" The top of her Ms. Gerard head barely cleared his shoulder. He could see her pink scalp. She smelled like jasmine, and he felt disoriented, as if he was somewhere else. Maybe a moon-drenched beach, maybe a resort where he and Stella might have stayed if he had ever taken a vacation. "I don't follow contemporary art," he said. "I'm afraid I just don't understand it." "You don't need to. Art is open to personal interpretation." She tilted her head, inspecting the portrait with him. He looked closely at the painting, too. The salmon-colored flowers in the foreground appeared to quiver. Their stigmas looked moist. It looked entirely too sexually suggestive, like something he might have seen in a magazine that an employee left behind in the bathroom stall, and his face flushed. "Most men ask me about my breast." She touched hers. "Women tend to understand these things." She looked at him slyly. She was standing too close, almost touching him, and he stepped back and cleared his throat. I'm more interested in the birds," he said. In the painting, the baby crows, quite robust, clambered up the walls of the nest, their beaks wide open. They're quite lifelike. I could imagine one could decide to fly right out of the painting. "Oh," she said, "you must be the fellow my niece told me about. You met one of my birds." "So it's true you had the bird released inside the museum." He was relieved he hadn't imagined it. "Not mine, yours. It's your bird. It appeared to you." Her intense stare unnerved him. He was aware of her throat, the tip of her tongue flicking in and out from between her teeth. He unbuttoned his jacket. Fortunately, he always carried a handkerchief, and he mopped his forehead. "The crow made you nervous?" "No, Roland said, well, yes. This is a museum. We can't have birds defecating on the artwork." She laughed, a kind of bird-like trilling, and he was actually aware of the satin red camisole she wore and the rise and fall of her breasts. He was thankful when the curator touched the artist's arm, diverting her attention off him. "Ms. Gerard, there are so many people who wish to speak to you. Our board members were instrumental in raising funds so we could showcase your art. Come, let me introduce you to them." As he was leaving the McCarthy that evening, he stopped by the gift shop, which had stayed open late. He thumbed through the pages of Marguerite Gerard, Perspective and Creation, and thought about buying it. But in the end, he decided on a jumbo postcard, "Crow at Dusk," suitable for framing. The next day he took it to a frame shop and chose a gilded Baroque design which reminded him of the frame used for Marguerite's self-portrait. He did not hang it right away. He'd been in the apartment 2 years and had yet to hammer a nail into the white walls. One evening, when it was raining and he could see nothing out the slider door, he finally unwrapped the brown butcher paper from the print. He got a level, pencil, and a hammer and a nail. And he moved the couch so he could sit and view the painting instead of the door. It took less than 10 minutes. At first he thought Mr. Cat was miffed over the new arrangement. But eventually the cat jumped up on the armrest, then on the backrest, and he walked the length of the sofa and sat behind Roland's head. They both stared at the print. Roland moved the lamp on the glass side table, and in the new slant of light, the crow appeared to lift a wing to take flight. The cat crouched, inching his paws into Roland's shoulder. Roland felt the soft rattling inside the cat's throat move through his arm, and then into his chest, and settle near his heart.